Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Mr. Paul Mount. Welcome, you're very welcome to the channel. A very big welcome especially to quite a few new subscribers who've joined, even since I did my last video for Doctor Who on the weekend. A few new people joining up every day, which is great to see. You're all very welcome. Hope you enjoy yourselves here on this channel. I hope that you'll find this channel is a bit of a break from the madness of the internet, the madness of YouTube, all the excitable YouTubers who shout at you and shout and blast their opinions in your face and criticise the things you like. Or they're there for clickbait. And the people who post endless videos of the latest news that you've picked up from other places already. So I just want this place to be a little quiet spot on YouTube where I am a little bit more senior than many of the youngsters out there. I just want to talk about the things I like, which are Doctor Who, films, TV, books, Blu-rays, going out and about, trips and things, in a nice, calm, civilised manner without any hysteria. So if you like the sound of that sort of thing and you've just started watching this channel, like and subscribe. Press that subscribe button, which is probably there, and like and subscribe as well. Leave a comment, and hopefully this will be a nice little place on the internet that's not going to raise your blood pressure, because I do find that a lot of the people who are interested in the things I'm interested in are very overexcited to the point of absolute hysteria, and we won't even get into talking about the clickbait idiots who just hate everything for the sake of it. I'm not here for clickbait. It's nice to get new subscribers. It's nice to see the channel building, but I'm not going to demand that you click on the channel. I'm not going to shout and scream and ask you to do me a favour and click and join and all that sort of stuff. I'm just here to provide my thoughts on things. However, having said that, I'm getting very, very close to 500 subscribers now, which is nothing in the scheme of things, but it's more than I ever thought this channel would get, to be honest. So if you are new and you do like this channel, please like and subscribe. It would be quite nice to get to 500 by Christmas. I mentioned this a week or so ago, and at the time I thought there's no way that's going to happen. But now it's getting closer. So if you are new and you found this channel, please subscribe. You don't have to watch the videos, but just subscribe to get me to that magical 500, and I'll be a very happy old codger. Thank you very much. Right, the subject of this video then is Doctor Who and the spin-offs of Doom. I thought with Doctor Who entering a new phase in its creative lifetime, that it would be interesting to look at Doctor Who's history of branching out into other areas, telling other stories within what is now known as the Doctor Who Whoniverse, before it was the Whoniverse. And I think especially in light of the way that we were left with the last episode, The Giggle, with a couple of quite significant pointers as to what sort of spin-offs we might get in the future. So I thought I would just briefly look at the history of Doctor Who spin-offs and talk about what spin-offs we might get. I mean, obviously Russell T Davies and Bad Wolf and Disney keeping their cards close to the chest, and I suspect that there may well be plans for certain things, but I think a lot of that's going to depend on how well Doctor Who does on the international stage. Disney will be keeping an eye on their streaming figures. The BBC, of course, will be looking at their viewing figures, which are, don't believe the hype on internet from people who tell you otherwise. The viewing figures very healthy in Britain at the moment. It is, or has been for the first 2 episodes of the specials, the top-rated drama on British television. Not the top-rated series, because we've got things like Strictly Come Dancing and the Celebrity Jungle thing, which always attract mass audiences, because they're the sorts of things that people, if they have to watch them live. Doctor Who does very well on catch-up, and as I say, the first 2 episodes of the ratings we have so far have been the top-rated drama in Britain on those 2 particular weeks, which is a massive change from how things were when Doctor Who came back in 2005, when it could only gaze up adoringly at the stratospheric viewing figures of the likes of Coronation Street, EastEnders, Emmerdale and Casualty, which had 5 or 6 million viewers more than Doctor Who. Doctor Who's viewing figures, despite what they tell you on the internet, have declined quite steadily in comparison, as the decline of other shows on television have absolutely been, I wouldn't say catastrophic, because these shows are still on TV, but of concern. I mean, the people who make Coronation Street must have a concern that the show once had 20 million viewers, now it can't get 5 million. And as it is with a lot of other dramas, a lot of other long-running shows, their audiences' numbers have plunged off a cliffs. And don't believe what they tell you on the internet, all these idiots who post graphs and downward arrows, Doctor Who ratings collapse. Doctor Who's ratings are very healthy. That is a fact. What they are telling you is lies. Anyway, wow, I've gone off the topic there. Yeah, so the Giggle sort of led to the possibilities of spin-offs. And I'll talk about those in a moment. As I say, it all depends on how the show performs going forward. And I have a good feeling about it, to be honest. But let's look back at the history of Doctor Who spin-offs. Now, of course, Doctor Who started, in case you didn't know, 23rd of December 1963, and became a massive sort of family hit series almost immediately. As soon as the Daleks arrived in the second serial, the viewing figures shot through the roof, and the show looked set for a long run. Nobody, of course, would have expected a 60-year run plus, but that's TV for you. And across the way, during that time, there's been, I suppose, the options of certain characters and creations and creatures that could conceivably have supported spin-offs. The first example of Doctor Who potentially spinning off, of course, was the Daleks. Back in 1966 or 67, I think, Terry Nation, the creator of the Daleks, whose agent very wisely gave him ownership of the idea of the Daleks. So him and now his estate after his passing have always had a massive influence and effect and say in where the Daleks are used. Bearing in mind they can really only be used in Doctor Who, they've often been a bit pernickety about them being used in adverts and comedy sketches, mainly because I think they wanted to maintain the reputation of the Daleks as evil monsters, not figures of fun. But back in the 60s, when Patrick Troughton took over, David Whittaker wrote 2 serials, The Power of the Daleks, which introduced Patrick Troughton in November 1966, and then later on in the season, The Evil of the Daleks, which looked as if it was going to be the last Dalek story because Terry Nation had withdrawn the BBC's permission for the BBC to use the Daleks. He was trying to pitch an American TV show featuring the Daleks. I think it went as far as pilot scripts being written. Nothing was ever filmed. It didn't come to anything. Nothing happened. I think it would have been something along the lines, if you remember the Dalek annuals that came out in the 70s, and even the Dalek World books in the 60s, they featured a sort of a space security squad, which I think is where the character of Sarah Kingdom was supposed to work for in the Daleks Master Plan in 1965. I think the idea was it would be sort of a war between humans and the Daleks, a bit like sort of Blake 7 versus the Federation type thing. I don't think the Daleks could support a series as sort of starring roles, if you like, because I don't think anybody could put up that grating monotone voice for a whole 45-minute episode without anything else. You'd have to have some sort of human factor involved in the storytelling. But I think that's what was broadly planned. It didn't come to anything. The series didn't happen, and the Daleks eventually worked their way back into Doctor Who in 1972. Now, there was some discussion, I believe, or some vaguely toying with the idea in 1977 of doing a spin-off series with Jago and Lightfoot, the theatre owner and pathologist who were supporting characters in the Talons of Weng-Chiang. And I don't know if that was ever discussed as anything more than we could do a series about them. That would be fun. A sort of period detective-y drama, a bit Sherlock Holmesy, because there was definitely a sort of a Holmes and Watson vibe about those two characters, except they were both Watsons, really. Neither of them were particularly bright. And I don't know how far that ever went, other than a vague idea in the production office. But obviously it never happened. But it was interesting that that was something that was considered back then. And of course, eventually Big Finish took up the mantle and did, I think, 7 audio adventure series. And of course, discussing spin-offs, I'm not talking about all the Big Finish stuff because I'd be here for the rest of the year because they've done so many spin-offs of so many different characters. I am talking purely about the TV canon of Doctor Who that's created spin-offs. And as I said, the first proper bona fide spin-off that we had was in December 1981 when K9 and Company aired on BBC One. This was a sort of a pilot for a proposed series that would star Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith, returning to the role that she played during the John Pertwee and Tom Baker era, and teamed up with K9. He'd just been removed from the series, but the producer of Doctor Who, John Nathan Turner, was aware that K9 was very popular and felt that he could work better outside Doctor Who, where he was too adept at solving problems and, the Doctor's mobile computer that could solve anything, and sort of detracted a little bit from the Doctor's own ability. So he spun off the idea of Sarah Jane, who he'd actually been trying to get back into the series at the end of Tom Baker's time, but Elizabeth Sladen declined. But he spun it off into an idea where Sarah Jane's on Earth as a journalist and the Doctor leaves her a version of K9 as a present. K9 and Company is most notorious, I think, for its signature tune and title sequence. And it's not hard to see why. But I actually quite like K9 and Company. It's quite nice because we hadn't had a spin-off before, and it was just before Peter Davison's first season started. And it was a nice reminder that life goes on for characters in Doctor Who after they've left the Doctor. And although it was a bit clumsy and clunky, I think the script by Terence Studley was actually quite good. The dialogue was quite naturalistic and flowed quite well. The story, if you remember, was Sarah Jane as a journalist taking up residence at the house in Morton Harwood, belonging in this typical English country village that Doctor Who had told stories in so often, where she was looking after her nephew while her aunt was abroad on a lecture tour in America. It was an odd story because it involved sort of witchcraft and sacrifice and stuff like that. It didn't necessarily sit well with the science fiction idea of a robot dog. But I think Elizabeth Sladen carried it very well as an older, slightly less patient and tolerant Sarah Jane. She's definitely more experienced and she has less patience than she had before. And I think she held the thing together. She was the glue that held it together. It's quite enjoyable. It did quite well. I think it had about 7 or 8 million viewers. I seem to recall at the time there was a power outage or something across part of the country. So it didn't do as well as BBC management might have hoped. Bearing in mind, as I said, it had about 7 or 8 million viewers that Doctor Who gets these days. That's how the TV landscape has massively changed since then. And that in itself is a whole video about TV ratings and how to understand them, which a lot of YouTube people either won't or don't do. And it was repeated the following year and did quite well again on BBC Two. And I think it was proposed that it would spin off into a series, but I think there was a management change at the BBC who weren't particularly interested. But that was K9 and Company, which aired over the Christmas period in 1981. We had to wait a very long time for the next Doctor Who spin-off because Doctor Who itself, of course, fell off air in 1989, so there wasn't any likelihood of being any spin-offs. There were, again, unlicensed spin-off video adventures featuring Sarah Jane Smith and Kate Lethbridge-Stewart and Victoria from the Patrick Troughton years fighting the Yeti. And in fact, interestingly enough, that is referenced as a previous adventure of Kate Lethbridge-Stewart in The Giggle, the most recent Doctor Who adventure, even though it was a different Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, a different actress played the part. But it's interesting that Russell has decided to make that little spin-off of Doctor Who part of the canon, which I think must be quite nice and heartwarming for the people who worked hard on tiny budgets back in the early 1990s to bring this Doctor Who spin-off to the screen. So Doctor Who relaunched in 2005, as you may remember. Massive success, huge success. BBC obviously wanted a bit more. Russell T Davies, realising that he had a really good crew who could make this sort of television, and he reasoned that the time when Doctor Who's not being made, it's not off the air, why couldn't they be employed doing something set in the Doctor Who universe? The idea of Torchwood was hinted at all through season 2. That was going to be an adult late night spin-off from Doctor Who, and Torchwood turned out to be the very first Doctor Who spin-off, airing originally in October 2006, just 18 months or so after Doctor Who itself had started. This was the adult spin-off that was more sexier and more violent and could deal with more adult matters. Starred, of course, John Barrowman, who played the charismatic Captain Jack Harkness in the first series of Doctor Who. He now commanded this elite investigative unit based under the Rift in Cardiff Bay, through which Flotsam and Jetsam, which was the original working title of the first episode, from the far corners of the universe would drift, and Torchwood was tasked to sort of salvage it, fight it if necessary, and cannibalise the technology. It was one of several Torchwood organisations across the world that was never particularly explored throughout the series. And it was a massive hit on BBC Three. It was a huge hit, so big that it transferred to BBC Two for the second series. And I think from a critical point of view, first season was tonally all over the place. I think that Russell, busy on Doctor Who, didn't have a chance to sort of properly establish the tone and the sort of things it should be doing. So some of the scripts were extremely clunky, and some of the scripts were by Chris Chibnall, who was the script editor, and of course he went on to produce Doctor Who over the last few years, and I'm constantly defending him from his critics who were calling everything under the sun and blame him for the death of Doctor Who, despite the fact Doctor Who is still in production, but there we are. But I think there were some issues with some episodes, and I think they were a bit like kids who've learnt about sex and violence, and they're sort of sniggering about the things they could get away with and the language they can put into the scripts. It felt a bit awkward. felt a bit self-conscious. But by the end of that first season, it was starting to come together a little bit. And then in the second series, it got much better stories, much more interesting scripts. Again, so successful that it moved from BBC Two eventually to BBC One for a long-awaited third series. This was a 5-part series called Children of Earth, which was screened in the summer of, I think it was 2011. I may be wrong there. I'll put the dates down there if I am wrong. This was a 5-part miniseries that had been in production and on the shelf for a while, and the BBC showed it in the summer. And it was a bit of a sensation. It was real water cooler TV because it was a very Quatermass story of this alien race called the 456 who returned to Earth, and they demanded a certain percentage of humanity's children because they used them as a drug, and they absorbed the energy and imagination of kids, and it was like a sort of a drug for them. Quite a bleak, in fact, quite a bleak, whoa, that's an understatement. Incredibly bleak story, very adult, very dark, very adult not in a sniggering nudge sort of way, very adult in the themes that it dealt with about how far humanity is prepared to go to save itself. Would you sacrifice your child to save the world? And of course it puts Jack himself in a terrible position when he has to do something that puts a member of his own family at risk. It's very bleak, very dark, brilliantly done, considering it's a BBC production on a relatively small budget. It looks great, it looks very cinematic. And in a way, it signalled the end of Torchwood, because at the end, Jack, appalled by what he's had to do, beams off into space, and it appears that Torchwood has ended. Wasn't to be, however, because in, I think it was 2012, BBC announced they were doing a new series of Torchwood, a co-production with the Stars Network in America. It was going to be a 10-episode series, which was called Miracle Day, which was based on an interesting idea where nobody on Earth could die. Something happens that nobody dies. They can be injured, crushed, crippled, burnt, but they will live on because of something buried deep beneath the Earth. It was an interesting idea, but I don't think there was enough meat in it to sustain 10 episodes. So you had a lot of wanderings and meanderings and distractions and padding, and unfortunately it sort of tailed off after quite a strong start in its first couple of episodes. I think what perhaps they should have done is had 2 5-part stories connected in some way, but not necessarily one long story. There wasn't enough there, and the ratings didn't do very well in America, tailed off in Britain, and unfortunately the show lost the momentum it had built up in Children of Earth, and Torchwood's not been seen since, although again Big Finish have picked it up and they've been doing bits and pieces, unfortunately, because of certain things about John Barrowman, which were already public knowledge, but which came out more publicly a few years ago. Captain Jack's been sort of sidelined now. He's not used in Torchwood, he's not mentioned in it anymore, and I think it's a shame, because I think John Barrowman, for all his faults, is a very charismatic actor as Captain Jack, and brings a certain something to him. And I suspect that when we saw him in that second Jodie Whittaker special a couple of years ago, it's probably the last time we'll see him. Shame, but that's the cancel culture world we live in. See the giggle for more details. The third Doctor Who spin-off was Sarah Jane Adventures, which debuted only a few months after Torchwood. It debuted on the 1st of January 2007, a 50-minute special on BBC One, and then the first of 5 series started later in the year. This was the spin-off that K9 and Company should have been, really. This was Sarah Jane Smith now as a more mature journalist, living in isolation. She's never really settled to a normal existence because of her experiences with the Doctor, which shows that travelling with the Doctor isn't all sweetness in life. It can have crippling emotional effects on people. But she's carried on the fight, and she's still investigating, and she lives in this huge house in London, and I think it's supposed to be Ealing, although it's actually Penarth, near Cardiff. She eventually gathers about her a team of junior investigators, along with a supercomputer hidden in the wall of her attic, and casual appearances by K9 when licensing agreements would allow. She carried on her battle with a range of extraordinary aliens, guest appearances from alumni from Doctor Who, including 2 Doctors, and her own sort of rogues gallery of recurring enemies, like the Trickster, who is this eyeless demonic creature who was determined to wipe Sarah Jane Smith out of existence. It's a really good fun series, very well written. It could swerve between being a bit slapsticky and then being quite dark and mature. There was one episode towards the end of the run that dealt with one of Sarah's friends, Clyde, played by Daniel Anthony. He touched this totem pole that made everybody hate him, and he became homeless. And it was a story that, behind all the science fiction trappings, showed how easy it is to lose everything and to lose the comfort of your home and end up on the streets. You had other episodes in the first series, I think, where Sarah Jane travels back in time to meet her own parents. She has the option, it's not impossible for her to stop them dying in a traffic accident, but she has that moral dilemma about whether she has the right to do that and change history. So it dealt with a lot of interesting themes about growing up, growing old, and finding friends. And it was a lovely, warm-hearted series, which ended, of course, prematurely and halfway through its fifth series when Elizabeth Sladen sadly passed away suddenly. And and now, of course, it's canonical that Sarah Jane herself has passed away. It's a great little series, and if you get a chance to watch it, I would advise you to watch it, because it doesn't feel like watching a children's television programme. It feels like watching a bona fide Doctor Who spin-off, which, like Doctor Who, can be very childish and very, very grown up. So, probably, I would say, the best of the Doctor Who spin-offs. One sort of tangential spin-off, which arrived in January 2010, was K9. This was an Australian series. This had been up in the air for years. That people have been talking about doing a K9 spin-off series for years, but there are always problems with budgeting and funding. And the BBC were interested, then they weren't interested. It was eventually made in Australia, a 26-part series. I've only seen 1 or 2 episodes. It's filmed in Brisbane, passing itself off as London. It's clearly not London. And K9 himself, because of copyright over the image of K9, only appears very briefly in the form that we recognise him, and then he sort of regenerates into this new, more obviously dog-like robot. Still voiced by John Leeson, who did the voice for most of the BBC K9. But as I said, I only saw a couple of episodes. It seemed breezy enough, but much more a children's programme than Sarah Jane Adventures even. It ran for 1 series and then sort of disappeared. The most recent spin-off from Doctor Who is the least successful, I suppose. That's Class, which debuted in October 2016, created by Patrick Ness. And this was, I think, Stephen Moffat's desire to create spin-offs in the way that Russell T Davies had. And this was, basically, it's about a group of angsty teenagers in Coal Hill School, which, of course, was the setting for the origins of Doctor Who, which is now Coal Hill Academy, where these bunch of kids get involved with... I've only seen a couple of episodes of this because I didn't think much of it. There's an alien prince who's on Earth as a student, protected by one of the teachers who's an alien. And because of the energy of the TARDIS, something to do with the TARDIS being around Coal Hill School at various points, which it hadn't necessarily been, it opened up a rift, a bit tortury, where things would come through and monstrous things would be attracted to the area. I saw the first episode, mainly because Peter Capaldi, who was the Doctor at the time, appeared in it at the end. I watched the second episode, but it didn't really float my boat, didn't grab my attention. And I think even by the time the third episode came along, the writing was on the wall, and we didn't think the series was going to come back. It was on BBC Three originally, then it moved over eventually to BBC One, where it tanked, and then it was quietly axed. And that was Class, the most recent spin-off we've had from Doctor Who. And I suppose we could say that since the inception of the Whoniverse, at the beginning of November, Tales from the TARDIS is a Doctor Who spin-off, the series that brought back old characters, reminiscing and framing an old Doctor Who adventure. And yeah, I would absolutely agree that that's a spin-off, but not necessarily the sort of spin-off that we might be expecting or hoping. So what do we think is coming in the future of Doctor Who in the world of the spin-offs of Doom? Well, of course, there have already been some rumours. Well, the series has been in production back at Bad Wolf, and with Russell T Davies having said he wants to create a universe, there should be an MCU-like universe. And if you think about it, what he did in the early 2000s, he was ahead of the curve, really, because he was creating different series and different projects for different characters in the way that the MCU exploded outwards in 2008 when Iron Man arrived, and they then released 30-odd films based on various characters. And I think Russell wants a bit of that sort of thing, which is what the Whoniverse is all about. That sort of banner that introduces episodes is very much based on the Marvel fanfare. And why not? So the talk that we've had so far, there's been lots of talk of different things. The most obvious one, I think, is a unit spin-off. And even though nothing's been mentioned, nothing's been confirmed, nothing's been stated, it just seems like an obvious one to do. Kate Lethbridge-Stewart is there, played by Gemma Redgrave. She's been in the show since, 2010? Off and on. Established as the head of unit. The giggle has shown us that they've got this huge Avengers Tower HQ in the middle of London with a helipad and a massive control room. You've got characters like Melanie Bush, played by Bonnie Langford, who now works for UNIT. You've got Shirley Bingham, played by Ruth Madeley, who's established. In The Giggle, of course, you may recall that Donna has now been recruited. Donna Noble, played by Catherine Tate, is recruited to join UNIT. So you've got massive potential there for a science fiction series about UNIT, exploring mysterious alien-y things when the Doctor's not around. It seems like an obvious one to do. When the set is there, I know that the exterior set, I believe, is still standing in the car park of Wolf Studios in Cardiff. It seems like an interesting one to do. So that's certainly one which I think must be top of Bad Wolf's considerations. But again, all this depends on how well these episodes are received. It would be a bit unfortunate to start work on 3 or 4 spin-off projects and Doctor Who struggles to get an audience. I don't think that's going to happen. But, let's not put the cart before the horse, or the horse before the cart. Cart before the horse. Let's not put the cart before the horse. The second spin-off, which seems sort of is handed on a plate after the last episode, is The Further Adventures of the Doctor and Donna. The Doctor, as you know from The Giggle, is now on Earth. He's got a family, he's got a home, he's not racing around the universe, saving everybody. The 14th Doctor, that is David Tennant. It seems obvious that won't... I can't imagine that'll just be parked there. I mean, just this week at the premiere screening for the Christmas episode, The Church on Ruby Road, Russell T Davies has said there are no plans for David Tennant to come back. I'm sure there aren't, but it doesn't mean to say he won't. I think what is a potential rather than a series. I'm not sure that David Tennant would want to commit to a long run as the Doctor again. I'm sure these episodes that we've just had took 2 to 3 months to make. I don't think he'd want to commit to 7 or 8 months playing the Doctor again. It's a bit like when you go on holiday. It's nice to go back to where you've been on holiday. You don't want to keep going back. You don't want to stay there. And I don't think he'd come back on a more full-time basis. Also because I think it undercuts the future of the series with Ncuti Gatwa. And I do think that's a concern a lot of people have voiced, that you've got David Tennant's Doctor lurking in the background. A lot of people have suggested it's like an emergency exit in case Ncuti's run doesn't work. Quick, wheel in David Tennant again. Don't think it'll work like that. But I think what is a possibility is a Doctor Who feature film starring David Tennant and Catherine Tate. That's something which could be an interesting diversion as a spin-off, a big screen spin-off, bigger budgeted, much loved Doctor returning for a big screen adventure. That may be a possibility. I don't see it happening on TV, other than possibly a 90-minute special or a 60-minute special episode maybe now and again, but I see it more on the big screen rather than clouding the issue on TV when there is a current Doctor. There have been a couple of other things I've heard mentioned, quite recently, one which seems completely ludicrous: the war between the Earth and the Sea, which is supposed to be the story of the Silurians and the Sea Devils battling again to conquer the Earth. I don't see that having any appeal at all, really. I mean, I'd watch it, of course, and it might be because the Sea Devils came back in last year's disastrous, I tell you, Easter special, Legend of the Sea Devils, that there might be an appetite to see them again. Don't think there is, and I can't see that is a show. It's a terrible title anyway, and I can't see that would be of much interest, really. I mean, hardcore fans will watch it, but unless you have some really fascinating human angle to it, which of course Russell would bring, but I don't see any legs in that as a series at all. There was also mentioned about an animated series about the Doctor's enemies when they're not fighting the Doctor. Their adventures of trying to conquer the universe, and the Doctor doesn't get involved. I think it was either an animated series or a live-action series, because of course the costumes for the Daleks and the Cybermen and the Jadoon and the Sontarans, they're all there. But I think it's been mooted as an animated series. Again, nothing's been said. Again, not something that hugely appeals to me. Might be an interesting thing if you want something a bit more kiddie-friendly. So that's a possibility, maybe. So those are the things that I've heard whispers of, that the press have got their hands on and championed with no real evidence apart from somebody feeding them lies, probably. What other spin-offs could there be? I mean, if you look at some of the characters who are around, I mean, I do think Katie Manning could do a Sarah Jane Smith type series, Joe Grant's Adventures or something. Although, of course, Katie Manning herself is into her 70s, I think now. Whether she'd be able to handle the physical commitments of a show, I don't know. But that character's been reintroduced. We saw her very briefly in The Power of the Doctor. Maybe they could do something there. Ace, Sophie Aldred, I can certainly see them doing something there. If you read a recent issue of Starburst, you'll have seen an interview I conducted with Sophie a couple of months ago. And I just mentioned to her there, what about the Ace Adventures? And she said, yeah, I'm waiting for that phone call. I'll be there like a shot. And she's a bit more front and centre now. Again, she's been in Tales of the TARDIS. She's been in Power of the Doctor. She is quite a spokesperson for Doctor Who now. She's always turning up at Doctor Who events. She has a profile. And she's very popular with classic fans. And I think that they could do something with that character. So that's something that's quite possible. The Daleks, you have to look at the Daleks. They always seemed to have the potential to do something. But as I said, it didn't happen in the 60s because you can't just have the Daleks. There's not enough personality from the Daleks individually. You could do some sort of space opera, as I said, a Blake 70 type thing. Beyond that, I mean, Russell T Davies has said, why can't we have the Nissa Adventures? I mean, I think he's probably pushing a point a bit there, really. But yeah, it's, you know, the whole Whoniverse is cracked wide open now, and there is a potential for all sorts of interesting things. I would be interested not in something that's necessarily long continuing dramas or series, but event things, you know, like I don't know, a Weeping Angels Halloween type story where some new characters are trapped by the Weeping Angels and have to fight their way out. Something to do with the Cybermen. There's so much you can do. And I don't think you just have to think in terms of the next series. I understand that for Disney's purposes, they're looking for episodes, lots of episodes. But with Marvel, they've done special presentations and things like that. I don't see any reason why you couldn't do a Doctor Who special. You could even do what people have been screaming about for years and have a Paul McGann thing. A miniseries with Paul McGann or a film with Paul McGann's Regeneration Adventures. You know, the options are immense. But I think you have to make your expectations a bit reasonable. You know, the pot isn't bottomless even at Disney. Their main focus is going to be establishing Doctor Who as a big worldwide super brand, as it already is with the BBC. But the whole purpose in this Disney co-funding, distributing model is to get Doctor Who out there across the world to make it big. Now, I've always had some, not concerns, but doubts that will happen. Doctor Who is a very different thing to Star Trek and Star Wars or Marvel. Doctor Who is very British, it's very quirky. It has a much more family-centric appeal. It doesn't necessarily appeal to geeks and nerds. It appeals to a younger audience. I don't know whether that audience exists worldwide. I think taking on board a science fiction franchise to appeal to that audience can work. Whether something that has such a broad church as Doctor Who can appeal across the world in that way, don't know. It's early days. We probably won't know for a few months how well the series is going down internationally. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's built to do that. So anyway, that's me rambling on a little bit. Let me know what you think, A, of this video and my reminiscences of the previous Doctor Who spin-offs and where we go in the future. Any other spin-offs that you think could have potential. And there is really anywhere you can go, you can sort of do anything. There's lots of characters who could be spun off in some format or other. But what would you like to see? Would you like to see series? Would you like to see a unit series? Would you like to see one-off Paul McGann film? Let me know. Throw in some ideas into the pot and we can have a good old chat about it. Right, hope you've enjoyed this video. It's gone on a bit long, sorry about that. Leave a comment down below, like and subscribe. As I said, it'd be lovely to get to 500. It'd be the best Christmas present ever if I could get to 500 subscribers in the next couple of weeks. So that's your job. Right, I'll see you soon. Until I do, you know what they say? Yeah, keep taking the stuff.